Hello, good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to the Rothenberg Hall here at the Huntington for the 7th in our series of Huntington Research Division Centennial Lectures. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here at the Huntington, where I look after the conference program, the fellowship program and the lecture program. Thank you for your consistent support of those programs. As you know, this is the centennial year of the Huntington. It's 100 years since Henry and Arabella signed the deed of indenture that turned their private collection into a public asset for the people and in particular for the scholars of the state of California and beyond. And ever since, the Huntington has been welcoming to its grounds and to its reading room scholars from all over the world who wish to conduct research on the remarkable collection that Henry and Arabella developed and has grown immeasurably since. The Centennial Lecture Series is designed to invite scholars back to the Huntington who have worked on the highlights of our collections and to revisit their relevance for an early 21st century audience. This particular Centennial Lecture is sponsored by the Cheng Foundation. I'm delighted to recall that it's almost 4 years ago now that the Huntington received a significant gift from the Cheng Family Foundation to create a series of programs and fellowships in the history and culture of the Asian American experience. The gift specified that the lectures must be on the theme of the Chinese experience in the Americas, and then they must be given in honor of George and Arlene Cheng. And I'd like on your behalf to thank Jennifer Cheng in particular, George and Arlene's daughter, for making this event possible. She can't be here this evening, but we are in her debt. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce to you the Centennial Cheng Family Foundation lecturer, Professor Mae Ngai. Mae is Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University. She holds her first degree from SUNY Empire State College and her MA, MPhil, and PhD degrees from Columbia. Her first faculty position was at the University of Chicago before moving to Columbia in 2006. She's the author of 2 significant monographs, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, 2004, and The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, 2010. That first book, Impossible Subjects, won no less than 6 separate prizes from the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, the American Studies Association, the Immigration Ethnic History Society, the Association of Asian American Studies, and the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. And that long list helps explain why Mae has been a serial offender when it comes to holding fellowships. She's a recidivist. She's received fellowships from the Huntington twice, from the Social Science Research Council, from New York University Law School, from the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, from the Institute of Advanced Study, and the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton, amongst others. She's also held invited visiting professorships at the Sorbonne in Paris and at Northeast Normal University in Changchun, China. In the last 3 years, she has published at least 3 extraordinary op-ed articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post on issues relating to US immigration policy, which I recommend that you read as a matter of urgency. To discuss the Chinese in the Huntington archives, hiding in plain sight, please welcome the 2020 Cheng Foundation lecturer, Professor Mae Ngai.
Thank you so much. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here tonight. I want to thank the Huntington and Steve Hindle. Special thanks to the Cheng Foundation for sponsoring tonight's lecture and for sponsoring my previous research fellowship here and my previous lecture here. I also want to thank Natalie Serrano, Catherine Wei Miller, Li Wei Yan, Peter Blodgett, Manuel Flores, Juan Gomez, Ben Tuttle, just a few of the staff here who make everything run so smoothly. Thank you all so much. I gave a lecture here a couple of years ago on this project, a book that is now nearing completion. The book is about the formation of the Chinese diaspora communities in the Anglo-American settler nations, which arose from the gold rushes of the 19th century. The book considers the experience of Chinese who went to the gold fields, their work, and the communities that they built, as well as the racial politics that arose from the reactions of whites, and how a global politics of Chinese exclusion evolved as it circulated from California to Australia and to South Africa. Of course, I will not repeat that lecture tonight. Rather, I will focus on some of the research that I did for the book with materials that are held here at the Huntington as a way to acknowledge the valuable resources here and to give you a sense of how historians use so-called raw materials to think about history, historical experience, and arguments. Because sources alone do not tell you that much, if anything. They can only come alive, they can only speak if you query them. And what you ask of them depends a lot on what you know about the context, on what you already know, and also about what you don't know. I started this project over 10 years ago when I was advising a college student who was writing a paper about the Working Men's Party of California. He conceded the party was racist, but he considered the anti-Chinese position of the party to be justified because Chinese were unfree labor. They were indentured coolies. When I told him that was not true, he pointed to a well-known book, Gunther Barth's book called Bitter Strength, published in 1964, which made that argument. Barth cited testimonies made in hearings made before the California State Senate and then the US Congress in the 1870s. The coolie thesis endured for decades, in large part because subsequent authors cited Barth, as well as the same testimonies in his footnotes, even though a casual perusal of those hearings, about 1,000 pages, will show you that multiple opinions of Chinese in California abounded in the hearings. Barth had cherry-picked testimonies that supported his arguments and dismissed the rest, including statements made by Chinese witnesses themselves. Rather than ask in the first instance, why was opinion on this subject so divergent and contradictory? So what is at stake in this controversy? Well, to be sure, Chinese and other indentured Asians, notably from India, worked in Caribbean and Indian Ocean plantation colonies in the 19th century after slavery was abolished in those colonies. Theirs is an important history in its own right. But the idea that the indentured status in the plantation colonies was transferred to Chinese in North America, as well as other settler colonies, became the grounds for their exclusion from those countries. It was a racial argument, not just that they were ostensibly contracted or indentured, but that there was something racial about it, that Chinese were innately servile, unfree, without any free will or individuality or agency. Now, to be sure, the coolies or the indentured workers on the plantations also were not without agency or personality. But my point is that exclusion was not a policy in those colonies where there actually were contracted laborers, but it became the policy in areas of so-called free labor. So it was not really about free labor versus contract labor, but about a racial exclusion made in liberal democratic societies. So I was motivated first by a desire to slay the coolie myth. But to do so required more than a different reading of the hearings of the 1870s. It was, above all, an empirical challenge, and then an interpretive one. And it's a big challenge because sources on early Chinese labor are scant and scattered, and there's little created by Chinese themselves that exist in the archives, or those that capture their voices. Some historians have tackled this kind of research, and with some important results, notably the work by Professor Su-Fan Chung, and most recently the team of scholars at Stanford University who have produced some work on railroad workers. So my hope is to contribute to that trend. I've often said that my research is akin to looking for needles in hundreds of haystacks. At the Huntington, thankfully, some people have already been through a good many haystacks. A wonderful subject guide on the Chinese in California has been compiled under the leadership of Huntington curators Peter Blodgett and Li Wei Yang. This guide lists scores of sources where Chinese appear, sometimes just fleetingly, but they appear in letters, diaries, journals, newspapers, guidebooks, travel narratives, photo albums, and pamphlets, most of them created not by Chinese but by whites, but they illuminate a lot if you know how to look at them and to think about them. These come from notations made by several generations of manuscript catalogers here at the library, as well as from specific exhibition and research projects, and most recently with the assistance of student interns from the University of Notre Dame. So with the help of this subject guide, I dived into the haystacks. So I want to share with you tonight some of the sources here at the Huntington that have helped me think about the experience of Chinese gold miners in California and some of my interpretations and conclusions. So this is a very famous photograph. A copy of it exists here in the Huntington, taken in 1852 at Auburn Ravine. This famous photograph shows both white and Chinese workers, but it is a picture that obviously is composed for the photographer, and it really doesn't tell us a whole lot. We can tell by their tools that the whites are miners, but it's not clear what is the kind of work done by the Chinese, or what is the relationship between these two groups of workers. The most common stereotypes about Chinese during the gold rushes is that either they work solo, as this man on the top with his rocker, or in gangs of so-called coolies. Another conventional view is that Chinese were excluded from mining districts by whites, excluded from new claims or from claims that they were only able to work claims that whites had sold to them or abandoned. So let me start with the second point. In May of 1852, the miners of the Columbia Mining District in Tuolumne County passed a resolution against Chinese miners. They were responding directly to a speech made by Governor John Bigler, who asserted that Chinese were unfree coolies. The Columbia miners railed against those who would, quote, flood the state with degraded Asiatics and fasten, without sanction of law, the system of peonage on our social organization, unquote. And they voted to exclude Chinese from mining in their district. The Columbia meeting and resolution were reported widely in the California press and inspired similar resolutions in other mining districts. But how widespread was this practice? There are other reports in the California press, but there is no comprehensive, let alone centralized, collection of mining district rules, so it's hard to say precisely how extensive was this practice of exclusion. So here's a source from the stacks in the library here, the Tuolumne County Miners and Businessmen's Directory, 1856. The directory includes every town and mining district of the county with a summary of its history, mining characteristics and prospects, each district's mining rules, and a list of its citizens. The entry for Columbia, we find the famous exclusion clause, and probably you can't read it, so I'll read it to you. Article 10, none but Americans or Europeans who have or shall declare their intention of becoming citizens shall hold claims in this district. Article 11, neither Asiatics or South Sea Islanders, this is a reference to Native Hawaiians, shall be allowed to mine in this district either for themselves or for others. So I went through this directory expecting to find similar language in the laws of other districts, but none of the others did. Here are the rules for Jamestown. And again, it's probably hard for you to read, but these are very typical mining district laws that you find throughout the state that govern things like the size of a claim, how many days of work is required for one to hold a claim, and the like. Here's another one from Jackass Gulch. This one is even more concise, but again, there's no mention of a racial or nationality requirement for who can mine in the district. I won't go through the entire directory, but according to this, Columbia was the only district or town in the county out of some 30 with a Chinese exclusion provision. So this source points to, I think, an unevenness in anti-Chinese sentiment on the goldfields, even within one county. I've seen other cases where newspapers report whites chasing Chinese off their claims, only to see evidence that months later, the Chinese have returned to the very same claims, and they continue to purchase and mine those claims. We might conclude that while racism was common, it was not ubiquitous, and that as long as there was still gold to be taken out of the rivers or the ground, whites did not want to keep up the kind of energy that was necessary to constantly fight against the Chinese and keep them out. Here's another source at the Huntington in the manuscript collection, a mining register for Smith's Flat, El Dorado County in the 1860s. Now, there are very few such mining registers around. They are extremely rare and valuable because they help us to understand the existence of Chinese claims, how they were organized, and how they compared to those of whites. And here is Smith's Flat. It's this area here, but actually the register includes this entire area around here. It's just east of the town of Placerville. You probably can't read this, I'll read it to you. So on the first page, you have a typical claim by a group of whites, 7 men who call themselves the Golden Shaft and Company. I say 7 because there are 7 claims that are registered, so that means 7 people, each conforming to the minimum or maximum amount of land that they could claim. It reads, a deep channel commencing 40 feet above Watkins and Company's shaft, running down the channel 300 feet to a certain stake in a southeast direction. And then their subsequent claims continue each with 300 additional feet in the same direction. At the bottom here, you see 2 claims by B.B. Stewart and Company, a hill claim, note on Negro Flat, which shows us how claims were named or areas were named by the first miners and then passed along to other people. Here we have, on a following page, a Hun, a Chinese, a Hun and Company, 6 consecutive surface claims, quote, going to a certain stake on the Arroyo lower line running down the ravine 300 feet. And then there are 6 claims going down, the same, repeating the same. Down below, you see other claims, one by a man named Jones, a solo claim from a stake near the lower garden of a ranch running down the ravine 300 feet, and one by an Elliott and Company, 2 claims, so it suggests 2 partners. And I like this one because it's on a pebble hill running from a California maple, ranging 1 point northwest, ranging down the creek to a cedar tree. Here we have similar claims by a Chinese named Alun and Company, 3 men this time, and it's a hill claim. And again by a Hun, who we saw earlier, 3 claims again designated by certain stakes. The bottom of this page, Ayao. No, Ayao's on the next page. The bottom of, oops, sorry. Here we have Ayao and Company. Registers 2 claims next to the Taft Mill, described by certain stakes, containing, quote, a lot of ditches and mill tailings, unquote, and bought of a Captain Taft for $60. Now, Taft comes back into the register shortly afterwards, here where he talks about a transfer. This is to certify, he says, that the register that the sale to Ayao was for the right to wash the tailings only and did not convey title of property or the right to continue to wash tailings. Okay, so what does this register tell us? Well, it shows first that Chinese registered their claims, which is evidence that they knew the laws and they played by the rules. Second, that their claims were not substantially different from those of white miners. They are not transfers, and they do not appear to either to be claims of abandoned ground, which is what the stereotype tells us, because I've seen other registers where abandoned ground is marked as such. It also shows changes in the nature of mining by the end of the 1860s, when, with the increase of quartz mining, which is deep mining, which required more capitalization and tended to hire men on wages. Both Chinese and whites worked in quartz mining until around 1870. Taft's mill was likely a stamping operation that crushed the quartz rock to get to the gold in the veins. And washing the tailings, that is the detritus that was left after the crushing for small traces of gold, involved a lot of labor for scant reward. But this was something that Chinese were willing to do when there was little else that they could do. Okay, so I want to talk to you about this diary by H.B. Lansing, written in 1853 and 1855. We don't know really where he was from, but he mined in and around Tuolumne County and also the neighboring county, Calaveras County. His diaries give a really interesting account of his life in California as a gold miner. There's a lot of details on mining for gold, buying and selling claims, equipment problems, bad weather, boils on his hands, etc. His partners are mostly other white American men, but he also works with Europeans and Chinese. His yields vary from the good to the middling to poor. He says it's like a lottery, which is what a lot of miners said. There's claim jumping, fighting, men leaving all the time for other areas or other kinds of work. He has one friend who goes to Australia. He alternates working on his own claim and working for others. Sometimes he hires himself out to work on a flume project, for example, or for building fences on a ranch. So here at the top, this is a little easier to read maybe. He says, hired 3 Chinamen and 1 Dutchman, run 2 toms, took out $87.50. Here he says, commenced work earlier than common, hired 2 Frenchmen and a darn poor Chinaman, took out 3 ounces and $7. Here he says, spent the day in rather an idle morning, slept part the forenoon, then went and prospected a claim for the Chinaman. After dinner, went to town. So you see here that he hires Chinese and others to work for him, but he also hires himself out to work for Chinese to do some prospecting. Here he said, claim begins to fail. Think some of selling it to Chinamen. The other pays well. But later he says, and there's several references in his diary about trying to sell failing claims to Chinese. Here on Friday the 12th in 1855, he says, worked but part of the day as I felt very unwell. Tried to sell a claim to some Chinese, but could not come it. They are getting entirely too sharp for soft snaps. So he has kind of ethnic biases, that's clear, but he also doesn't have a lot of hostility either, right? They're part of his world. He works with them, he hires them, he works for them, and he tries to sell stuff to them, but he's not always successful. And here he says, took dinner at the Chinaman's, so a Chinaman ran a cafe or a restaurant of some kind, chicken pie, soup, and more good things. Okay, now I want to talk about gangs and work gangs. Chinese labor built during the gold rushes, the water infrastructure of the gold fields, miles and miles of flumes that carried water from high snowmelt areas in the mountains, and they also built and worked in hydraulic mining, giant high-pressure water hoses that blasted away the sides of hillsides and washed gold out of the gravel. That was America's first industrial environmental disaster, and it was declared illegal, but not until the late 1880s. Hydraulic mining employed hundreds of Chinese in the 1860s and 70s as work gangs, often organized by headmen. So here we have the El Dorado Water and Deep Gravel Mining Company, which is a hydraulic mining company, and their Chinese time book. So there's a separate ledger for the Chinese workmen. And just to give you a sense, we looked earlier at Smith's Flat. Here's Negro Hill that was mentioned. Here's Placerville. And this is the area where there was hydraulic and drift mining. This is a present-day map, so it doesn't really show the historical, but just to give you a sense of where these places were located. So I took, here you have a page from this Chinese time book. A work gang, Sinki, number 2, his number 2 gang, the foreman, and then you have a running thing of how many hours or how many men worked on those days, and at the bottom you have a reconciliation of their wages. So this book goes on and on and on and on. So what I did was I spent a few days and I made a spreadsheet. It's not hard, you just have to sit there and do it. This is what we do. This is the really exciting work of being a historian. So what I learned was that from May through the summer, there was 500, 600, 800 men per day working, mostly digging, but sometimes blasting. Digging paid $26 a month, blasting $28, and it goes on. So you have the different work gangs and an accounting of how many men work. So it's not the same every day. Every day it could be, Ahing had 7 gangs, and the number of men who worked each day varied from 22 to 80. So, and then it drops off. So here you have, in October, it's down to 272 people. In November, down to 88 people. So obviously the work is dropping off. Now, I think that they were building the initial infrastructure for this operation, but the work also is seasonal. So if you have 800 people working a day on average, where do they live? Right? And they're also transient because they're only working there for a few months, and not all 800 have work every day. So what kind of social organization exists to support this kind of labor? So I think that they probably lived in camps, in tents, nearby the work site. In 1870, there were 1,500 people of Chinese origin in El Dorado County. I don't think those 1,500 were the ones who worked on this project. I think they came in from elsewhere. Maybe some of them, but I think a lot of them came in from elsewhere. In Placerville, where there was the largest concentration of Chinese, there were miners as well as merchants and prostitutes, a fishmonger, gamblers. It's about a mile from Smith's Flat. And Chinese lived in other towns south of Placerville, in places like Diamond Springs and Mud Springs. But probably more Chinese came from outside the county to work for the El Dorado Water and Deep Gravel Mining Project. We can imagine that they might have walked to Placerville or another town on the day off, but that would have been a several-mile walk. I've seen other data in census records that show mining encampments, and you see among every dozen or 20 miners somebody who's listed as a cook. So they probably went to town and got provisions, and then they cooked for the men on site. So this question of how people supported themselves, so here you see, this is old Placerville. I'm sorry, this is from the 1890s, so it doesn't really show you much. But here you have the old town, which is a half a mile from the current downtown. And in this constellation here, you probably can't see it, but there's a lot of these buildings are vacant, but there's one building that says Chinese dwelling. And here, also in 1898, in Placerville, there is a section of town next to the Beach and Company's planing mill, shingle mill, and box factory. And you see right adjacent to this mill, you see here Chinese, brick and sand. These are storage sheds, but the Chinese are in charge of them. And here in the yellow, this says Chinese dwellings. So probably these were not miners. They worked in this shingle and box factory, and they also tended to the sand and the shingles that were on site. So I'll come back to this later, this way that the maps have of designating Chinese inhabitants. So going back to the question of, what was Chinese life like besides working? What kind of communities did they have? How did they provision themselves? Well, one other source we have here in the library are the account books of a white merchant named Andrew Brown in Kernville, California. The library has two of his account books, one in 1870s and one in the 1880s. Brown himself was an Irishman who came to San Francisco in 1852. He tried his hand at mining and farming, and later moved to Kernville and operated a quartz mill, and later he owned a general store. So what's interesting first is that he has separate account books for his Chinese customers, right? So here we see in the first account book a page which is China Joe's account. He's buying rice, candles, whiskey, tobacco, and tea. He pays by cash, $59.66. Later, he buys a can of lard, some sugar, a sack of rice, more whiskey, soap, sardines, a 13-pound ham, sugar and tea, another sack of rice, a 12-pound ham, tobacco, and a pair of slippers. So this gives you a sense of the kinds of things that Chinese consumed. Now here you have, again, his account continues. We have more rice, more ham, more whiskey, tea, tobacco, whiskey, matches, oysters. Oysters are popular, sugar, sarsaparilla, candles, salt, etc. Now, what's striking here is that he pays for everything in cash, right? So he's some kind of worker. It doesn't say what he does for a living. But let's look at these accounts from Fang Hoi and Awa. These are also Brown's accounts, but from another book. And in this book, he has on the left side the debits, and I'll show you on the right side the credits. Fang Hoi purchased rice, barley, bran, a wrench, a sack of rice. He paid for stage fare, so he went somewhere. What is this? Balance on merchandise, so miscellaneous goods, more merchandise. Can't read that. Okay. But on the credit side, what's interesting is that he pays in various means. Unlike the first guy, China Joe, who pays for everything in cash, he pays here by vegetables, potatoes, and cash. So he settles this account of $7.93 through vegetables, potatoes, and cash. Here again, he pays for the sack of rice in cash. Later, he pays with a bag of onions, more vegetables, cash, and potatoes. And here, he's paying a bill of $5.50 with gold dust. So even in 1886, gold dust is still circulating in the population. And here he's paying by cash. So I thought this was really interesting. Here we have awa. Awa, you gotta love awa. Duck, tobacco, oysters, envelopes, so he's writing somebody. Whiskey, of course, more oysters, takes out cash, 2 ducks, not sure, oh, a pair of boots and overalls and matches. So how does he pay for his goods? Through his wages, deducted from his wages. Pay 69.25 days work for $69.25. So he earns $1 a day, and that settles his account for the month of August. And again, he pays, his balance due is $4.58. So other things that you see in these account books in terms of items commonly purchased by Chinese in the interior of California are road taxes, which they had to pay $2 a year, not only stage fare and envelopes, but also stamps and express charges. They buy spools of thread, cotton cloth, flannel and batting, shoes, boots, pants, drawers, and socks, work gloves, rope, and other kinds of tools. And they also take out cash advances. These show us that Chinese were especially fond of certain foods, oysters, ducks, and rice. But in general, they purchased goods that were common among miners and working people in the California interior: whiskey, candles, boots, work tools. This was not a universal practice, but it was not uncommon for a Brown to keep a separate account book for his Chinese customers. And it points to a phenomenon which I think I've tried to trace here for you tonight, that I would describe that Chinese were apart and yet apart. Meaning that they are part of the society that they live in, and yet they're still somehow separated out in the minds and practices of white people. Sometimes the Chinese are rendered hyper-visible, as in separate account books or in the maps that I showed you. And other times they are invisible, as in the company payroll books, where they have no names, just numbers as part of a Chinese work gang. Only the head man has a name. In other payroll books, I have seen every white person listed with a name, including those hired as unskilled day labor. So Chinese are both rendered hyper-visible in maps and also invisible in other kinds of records. So I want to just pursue this for a moment. Here's another example of, these are fire insurance maps made by the Sanborn Company. And we don't really have them for the earlier decades of the gold rush, but we have them for later. So this is Jamestown in Tuolumne County, 1898. And here you see a very typical map where you have this section of town. It's not the main downtown area. And here you have this group of, so yellow means wooden structure. And here you have saying, you probably can't read this, it says Chinese shanties. And this is where the Chinese lived. Other houses just have a D for dwelling, right? So white people live in dwellings, but Chinese have Chinese shanties that are marked, right? The green color is the insurance company's designation for a special fire risk. So it includes a stove company, a blacksmith, but the laundries are designated Chinese laundries. And here you have a Chinese vegetable garden, not a vegetable garden, but a Chinese vegetable garden. So in this way, so from a researcher's point of view, it's very useful because you can see where the Chinese live. But you have to think about, why do the map makers want to single out the Chinese for specific ethnic reference when the map is not really about ethnicity, it's about what kind of building construction exists and what kind of fire hazards exist. Now, on the other hand, here's an example of invisibility. So we go back to the Tuolumne Miners and Businessmen's Directory of 1846, and there's a town called Chinese Camp. It's kind of a ghost town now. But the entry for Chinese Camp says this: our personal knowledge of the camp is very limited, and in order to get correct data, we have appealed to some of its most prominent citizens to give its history and prospects as a mining locality. In this we have failed, and can therefore but state that Chinese Camp is situated in the northwestern portion of the county, some 12 miles from Sonora, and 2 from Montezuma. Her population must be near or perhaps over 1,000. The improvements consist of good and substantial wooden buildings, also 1 or 2 most excellent fireproof storehouses, some first-class hotels, several saloons, banking and express offices, etc., etc. And then it goes on to talk a little about the mines there, and then it has the mining laws, which are, again, typical of most mining laws in this era, without any reference to nationality. Now, Chinese comprise a large majority of this town's population. He cites 1,000 people living in Chinese camp. Most of them were Chinese. And the directories actually, if you can see from the former entry above, they also list all the residents of the town. So in Chinese camp on the next page, I don't show it here, there are 200 white people who are listed as residents of Chinese camp. So who are the other 800 people? Well, they're the Chinese residents of Chinese camp. And so although there was a white business section, like noted, express office, a bank, blacksmith, etc., but Chinese businesses also served whites, especially their wash houses and cafes. A man named Chi ran an eating house on Washington Street in a shack with a stove made of creek stones covered by a sheet of iron. According to legend, he served 49ers wild pigeon pie, grilled bear steak, and apple pie. Now, the vast majority of Chinese living in and around Chinese camp were gold miners, but the town boasted a diverse population befitting a commercial and social hub: merchants, laundrymen, and prostitutes, as well as tailors, herbalists, bakers, butchers, gambling hall operators, and a musician. 2 merchants, Assam and Fin Long, each held $500 in real estate and $2,000 in personal property. Newspaper articles of the time tell us that by the middle 1860s, Chinese merchant houses were reportedly earning from $50,000 to $100,000 a year. A Chinese vegetable garden and a fish pond lay at the edge of town, which meant that Chinese had access to fresh vegetables and fish, both especially prized elements of their diet, and even turtles, a delicacy. There were a few women in Chinese camp, seamstresses, prostitutes, and miners and merchants' wives. White Americans called a woman who raised fowl Duck Mary, and the garden farmer China Lena. How did Chinese come to this area? Well, this is a current day topographical map, so this Don Pedro Reservoir wasn't there in the 1860s. But Chinese camp was originally called Washington Camp, and it was, but a group of Chinese were on the other side of the hill working in Woods Creek. And in 1849, a large group of them, perhaps 50 to 75, arrived over the hill. They had been mining on Woods Creek and were driven off their claims by whites. This was a common occurrence in 1849 among all ethnic groups, and there is no evidence that it was especially racially motivated. But soon other Chinese stopped at Washington Camp because it was on the main stage road between Sonora to Yosemite. Camp Washington quickly became known as Chinese Diggings, and finally Chinese Camp. The latter name became official when a post office for Chinese Camp, California, opened in the general store in April of 1854, and that is the original building that still exists. I don't think the air conditioner was there in 1854, but the iron doors were. In just a couple of years, in 1856, when there were still thousands of Chinese living in and around the town, they were somehow invisible in the Tuolumne County Mining and Business Directory. Now, this history of Chinese camp began to be recovered in the 1960s and 70s by local historical societies who became interested in the multicultural history of California. The Huntington has a robust collection of local historical newspapers and journals. They are a treasure trove because they contain generations of local knowledge, although not everything is verifiable. They are very helpful to me along with other sources like census manuscripts, newspaper articles, legal records, maps, and the like. So here we have a page from the census manuscript of 1860, and it shows that it shows us a couple of things. You probably can't read all of this, but it shows, first of all, if you see here, place of birth, you have China, but then you have Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, California, other places, California, then you have more Chinese. So they tended to live on the west side of town, but they did not live in what you could call a strictly segregated area because they lived in the same neighborhood where white people also lived. And this is an interesting page because it shows you evidence of families. There are two families listed here. Afao and his wife Chun Ki, with two children aged 10 and 4, both born in California, and Sing Fong and Sa Su, with 3 children aged 6 to 12. And you could also see, well, if you could read this, you could see that there are white children of the same age who says they're at school, but the Chinese are at home. See, here's at school. These are white children, and the Chinese don't go to school. Chinese camp also had 4 native place associations, or huiguan, which marked the town as a significant center for Chinese in the region. The town also boasted 3 so-called temples that were large structures with luxurious gold leaf carvings and images. The residents of Chinese camp strived to make their surroundings beautiful. They planted persimmon trees, and at the Lunar New Year, they planted narcissus bulbs, an early spring bloomer. And they planted trees of heaven, which I believe are still there today. Trees of heaven are a pungent variety of sumac, native to China, that was valued for its medicinal uses from its bark and leaves. Some said these tall shade trees reminded Chinese of home. The trees of heaven remain throughout the town and in the surrounding area, including outside the old post office. So I want to conclude with just a remark about these trends of hypervisibility and invisibility that exist in the archives. Hypervisibility and invisibility work together. Hypervisibility marks Chinese as different, perhaps even dangerous. Invisibility reinforces that by making hypervisibility a specter, something that's disassociated from actual or real people, because the real people are invisible. So it's my hope that my book will contribute to reclaiming and interpreting Chinese in 19th century California as real people that are neither hypervisible or invisible. Thank you very much. Do you want me to take questions or comments from the audience? I'm happy to.
Thank you. So we have time for questions. Our experience in this room is if you shout your question out, everybody can be heard. So please stand and project. Are there questions? Hi there, go ahead.
Considering the activities of missionaries in China during that time, is there any indication that missionaries came into the Chinese mining communities, American missionaries worked with them?
The American missionaries mostly, they started their work in the cities, in San Francisco, of course, in the 1850s, and then they go to places like Sacramento. There are records of Chinese American missionaries in small towns throughout the state, but they appear a little later, I think after the peak of the gold rush. They appear maybe in the 1890s or even the early 20th century.
Hi there, back in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, shout.
How did in Brown's book, how did the payment methods in the non-Chinese book compare with the Chinese book?
Oh, that's a great. how did the method of payment in Brown's Chinese books compare to his other books? I don't think the library has other books. But I've seen other books. And I've seen books of merchants where they don't have separate books for Chinese. They're just listed with everybody else. And I think throughout the interior, the common practice is to give credit to the end of the month without interest. So you go and you purchase or you buy whatever you need, and an account is kept, and at the end of the month you have to settle up. If you don't settle up, I think then you might incur interest charges. And I think people from what I can remember in other ledgers, they pay mostly in cash, but sometimes they pay in gold dust. It's not that frequent that you see people paying in vegetables.
Hi there, just on the right-hand side, go ahead. Yep.
You mentioned that the typical wage is about $1 a day. How does it compare with what an unskilled white laborer would make?
Oh, they would make, right, at least $1.50. Sometimes more, sometimes $1.75.
Go ahead.
Everything you've shown is in English. Are there documents in Chinese, or are these people almost entirely illiterate?
He noticed that these documents are all in English, and were there other documents in Chinese, or were the Chinese illiterate? The Chinese were not all illiterate. It varied. Some of them were illiterate. They signed things with an X, but other Chinese were literate, and there are documents that are in Chinese, which I have difficulty reading thoroughly, but there's a famous merchant, a Chinese merchant in California that left tons, just volumes and volumes of accounts, and his customers actually were mostly whites, but those records are in Chinese. So the Huntington's records are mostly in English, and as you can see, these are records created not by Chinese themselves. They are the needles I find in the haystacks where white people are doing business with Chinese or talking about Chinese that they hire or whatnot. Sources in Chinese created by Chinese. There are a few in the Huntington, there are some, but in general they're not that common in California. There were a few newspapers published in the gold rush era, very few. There's one that's extant that has an issue here in the Huntington. And they report, a lot of them report on news from China or their advertisements for merchants in the area.
Can I ask you, Mae, about something that you left implicit in your discussion of the fire insurance records? So why would the fire insurance company, whose purpose is to record building materials, choose to identify ethnic origin?
It's a really good question, and I'm not sure why, but I think it had become a practice in California. There are very early maps made of San Francisco, which was made of Chinatown, where and the surrounding area, where all the Chinese buildings are identified, Chinese dwellings. There are some dwellings that are marked Chinese prostitutes. Those are not fire insurance maps. These are maps made by the police department, and they were made in order for purpose of surveillance and policing, and basically a kind of racial census of a kind. And so that might be the origin of a general, what becomes a more generalized practice of noting where the Chinese are. But there could be other reasons. I think it's speculation, right? This is maybe calls for more research. They might think that if there's a fire, the fire department may not be able to communicate with all of the residents of a town, so they have to tell them where the Chinese are. That would be my most benign interpretation, but I'm speculating. Right.
Is there anything in the Huntington archives about the Chinese massacre?
The one in LA?
Yeah.
Not that I've seen specifically.
Just curious.
Hi there, go ahead.
I was aware that tongs actually serve a very, very important function of importing laborers from China. I was wondering if you saw any of the traces of tongs in the records.
So she said her understanding is that the Tongs were active in recruiting labor for China, and were other evidence of that in the records. So I think that is part of the myth about the importation of contract labor of Chinese into the United States and California. The Tongs so the standard organization of Chinese, which today we call the Chinese Six Companies or the CCBA, the Chinese Family and District Associations, they were the organizations actually that white people accused of recruiting Chinese labor, right? They were the more traditional family-based or hometown-based, district-based, native place organizations. And whites developed a theory that these were despotic organizations that controlled all their members. And they did not. They could not control all their people. I mean, you paid dues to your native place organization. There were certain benefits one could get. You know, you could receive mail there. If you became indigent or sick, they would take care of you. You know, you could go there for a meal. And they often referred people to jobs, but they were not job agencies or recruiters. The Tongs were a different kind of organizations. The most famous was the Zhigong Tong, or in Cantonese called the Chi Kung Tong. There's also there are also several other Tongs. These are what you would call secret brotherhood societies, and they're actually transplants from China, from the Tiandihui, right? And these were fictive kin organizations. So while the traditional organizations are based on native place or clan membership, the brotherhoods were fictive kin, right? They were people who were estranged from their native families or villages, single men who were somehow marginalized. And so the secret brotherhood societies were a kind of proxy for them. And actually, and I didn't talk about this here, but in a lot of my research, I found that these brotherhoods constituted like mining cooperatives throughout California, where they had equal shares in the claims. The claims registers I show here, you can't tell if they're equal shares or not, right? They're not marked as such, but there's other evidence that suggests that the Tongs become involved in the vice industries, opium, gambling, prostitution, things like that.
Hi there, Peter. To follow up on the question about the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, just very recently, a researcher named Scott Zesch has published a very interesting book on that massacre, and he's found a number of court cases in the Los Angeles County area records that do bear upon the events of that most disastrous happenstance. And so there are records, but they are very hard to find.
So the book is by Zesch, you said?
Zesch.
Okay, great to know.
SCH, if memory serves.
Oh, thank you. It's great to know.
That's why you keep me on the payroll, man.
In your research, did you find any indication of ethnic groupings among the white population?
That's a great question. I think in the early years of the gold rush, maybe from 48, 49 through the 50s, there were very distinctive groups. Europeans, French, German, Irish, they're very distinctive. There are also people from Chile, from Mexico, Sonorans. So white, native-born American whites identified themselves as Americans. And they had a lot of stereotypes and conflict with Europeans, with Chileans and Mexicans, and with Chinese, and with Australians. So the native-born Americans, I think, developed a kind of nativism towards all non-American miners as a kind of a way to weaponize difference for a purpose of competition. It's all about competition, right? And so the first people they go after are the Chileans and the Sonorans. Why? Because they actually knew mining. They were practicing silver mining and copper mining. So they actually taught Americans how to use a pan, right? The original is a batea, it's a basket, right? That's what becomes the mining pan. So the first to really suffer from ethnic violence in Sonora, there's a huge massacre of Mexican and Chileans, and they drive them out of the county. Then they go after Europeans. And the Chinese come a little later. The Chinese don't really arrive till after 1850, and by that time, most of the Europeans have been driven out of the gold fields. The only ones that survive are Irish and German, who the Americans seem to have more, I don't know, they have some more affinity with them. So when Chinese are the only other foreign group left, they have really the hostility becomes targeted against them, and then you have the rise of this coolie myth that they're like slaves, right, which fuels, gives the nativism a special flavor because they're being compared to slaves, which is very handy because they can be then associated, it's a shorthand, right, for African American slavery in the South.
And we'll take a couple more right in the corner, go ahead.
Just on the same lines, where are the Native Americans in this?
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, in 1848 and 1849, there were Native Americans all up and down the coast. And they were actually participated in gold mining. Actually, you know, when Marshall finds gold in Sutter's Mill, there's one story that says an Indian was the one who picked up the gold, right? And Marshall took it and claimed that he got it. So there were Indians of a number of tribes, Miwoks and others up and down California. And in 1849, when the 49ers first start to come, Native Americans were probably half of those working in the gold fields. And some of them worked on their own account, they worked in family units, and others worked for white people, either for wages or for subsistence, which was a kind of holdover from the old mission system of using Indian labor. What happens, which is really tragic, is that when the 49ers come down from Oregon, they're among the, this is before anybody comes from the East Coast, right? This is still very much a Pacific Coast thing. When the 49ers come down from Oregon, they go after the Indians. And there's massacres, there's a lot of violence, and between 1849 and I would say 1851, there's tremendous amount of loss. And the Indians get pushed up into the hills beyond where there's gold. And many of them are really starved to death. So within a few years, they're driven out of the gold fields. And the territorial government, the territorial governor makes a point of saying, we will extinguish all of them. And they send the army after Native Americans, especially in Southern California. So it's a very tragic story. Thank you for asking me about that.
One last question. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you ever came across this, I don't know if it's a myth, I just want, I'm curious of this thing called the Chinese walls, where there's stacking of tailings in the mine. I'm just curious, is it a myth or is it actually?
No, they are there. You can. She was asking about the Chinese walls. Did they exist? Were Chinese stacked stones, right, in the gold areas? Yes, they do exist. You can find pictures of them still, some of the remnants on the internet. They were often stacked after they washed tailings, as I was describing, or they built them around encampments. I think they served a variety of uses, but yes, they did exist. Okay.
Well, I'm glad to finish on a more optimistic note. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your consistent support of our programs. Please join me in thanking Mae Ngai for a masterclass lecture. Please join us outside for coffee and cookies, and we hope to see you again very soon.